Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. This week, I'll have a report on the Tal Memorial Rapid and Blitz tournament. But first, let me wrap up the Aeroflot Open that I was reporting on before, and we had a brief interlude while I did my tribute to Anatoly Lane. The 24-year-old Belarusian Grandmaster Vladislav Kovalev emerged as a clear winner with 7 out of 9, and he finished a half a point ahead of the Indian Grandmaster Sethuraman and the young Russian Gordievsky, who played at the U.S. Open. If anybody was there, you saw him in action. So they also had great results at 6.5. It was a tournament where a lot of the top seeds took it on the chin, as we saw in some of the games, and not really surprising in Russia. You know, there's so much depth of talent there. The win that catapulted Kovalev into first place came in the penultimate round. It was against a player that I profiled before for knocking off Fedoseev in this tournament. And but here, the young Iranian Tabatabaei got outsmarted in the opening and had to play catch-up. So Kovalev here playing white. And this time it's a French defense. Bishop d3. This is a tricky little move. One of my students presented this to me once, and so I did a little research, and I saw that it's not really that dangerous for black, except there is one kind of tricky trap which black actually kind of falls into in this game. Knight c6, and now bishop e3. And in this position, black has a couple of choices. He can go for take it in a little sharp direction with e5, and then we could see bishop c6, pawn takes, de5, and now queen trade and knight g4. This seems to be about equal chances. Black has a lot of activity to compensate, and the bishop pair to compensate for these weak c-pawns. Black could play more solidly by taking on d4 and playing knight e5, or it's also possible to start with bishop e7, and then white probably plays knight bc3, I think, and then again black can take on d4 and play knight e5. And I don't really see any advantage for black and for white in that position. But knight d5 looks like a very natural move to harass the bishop on e3. The problem is that white takes and plays knight c3, and I think of this as a little bit of a trap. We've seen this in several grandmaster games, but actually white has won almost every one of them. The one exception being a game between Caruana or Kramnik and Caruana. But even there, probably white had the better chances. So, black can grab this pawn. And the problem is that a knight b5 is going to be a real sneak attack. The black could take on h2 and maybe should. Maybe. Even though it certainly looks like a non-starter after knight b5, but maybe black can play f6, sacrifice the rook in the corner, and try to get some counterplay going. But objectively, I don't think it should be very good for black. But black also has problems after queen f3. Same move, knight b5, rook b8. And now white takes on c5. It's just a much better position for white. Now, in the one game that black won, that was the aforementioned Kramnik-Caruana game, bishop d7. It went knight check to stick the king onto the d file, so no castling today. Knight went back. And then we saw knight e5, queen d4. Queen d5, castles, queen takes d4. And now instead of bishop takes d4, which looks good but was met by knight f3, and black is in good shape, White should take with the knight, knight ed4, and this looks very strong for white. Bishop f4 is a threat, and black just does not seem in time to get everything defended. Now, in this game, black played f6, make room for the king, and knight d6 check, and picks up a nice little tempo by attacking the pawn on g7. And king f7, queen c7 check, so black has to further weaken the position. Rook d1. The one bright spot for black is that white can't castle because the knight on e2 is hanging, but still looks pretty dodgy for black. And now the best move is most likely b4, trying to dislodge the knight to be able to either penetrate with the queen, or also the rook on b8 can be hanging. b4 is probably just a crusher, but Kovalev plays knight d4, and this is not nearly as clear because after queen d5, we end up getting an endgame, and white looks for the win of an exchange, but it doesn't quite materialize. So he gets his pawn, but this endgame is not totally clear because the bishop's opposite colors. And in fact, Kovalev plays it in a little bit of a surprising way in that he trades here. He doesn't try to get the passed pawn on d6, which he might have felt would get blockaded. So he instead kind of went with this bubble of pawns on the queen side. And I think he was definitely showing great confidence in his endgame technique, or maybe feeling that he could outplay his young opponent in that type of position, and when he probably could have made more of the position. But around here, black could definitely look for improvements. Transferring the bishop to c6 looks like a good idea, and I have a feeling black has a very, very good chance to draw with good play. But I think black really kind of never got the thread going here. He really gave white a lot of leeway in pushing those pawns, didn't get an effective blockade going, and that ended up being very strong for white. And with rooks on the board, very often it's hard to effect a successful blockade, even with bishops opposite colors. And there, now things start to shake loose. And already white may be winning in other ways, but he's gotten to a position where the b pawn can't be stopped. So after b6, black resigns. So a nice victory for, I would say, the not very well-known Vladislav Kovalev, one of many strong players out there that can often get lost in the shuffle, but he's the big winner at the Aeroflot tournament. So very nice result for him. All right, on to the Tal Memorial, which brought together many of the world's elite players, with a little more emphasis on Russian players, perhaps, than most of those events. Vishy Anand continues to defy the aging process. He came first in the rapid portion with 6 out of 9. His signature win featured a stunning combination against Alexander Grishuk, which was not very complicated, but quite beautiful. So we'll have a look at that next. Okay, so this was a Sicilian, a Roslimo variation. And although it seems like taking the knight is kind of a positional way to play, to double the pawns, it very often leads to this this sharp game that we saw here. This variation has been played many times where white builds up for this kingside attack, and black eventually tries to counter on the queen side, although white is really kind of getting the action going first. Black hopes that he will eventually get a counterattack on white's king. So we see both players really kind of building their position on each side. And white strikes first. White gets things going and creates some threats here with knight f5. So he gets that in. And he opens some lines on the king's side, but still not that easy to break through. So the position is still fairly balanced. And Vichy actually, takes a little bit of a chance here in sacrificing that pawn, rook g5, and actually from this position, I think Komodo suggested king c1 for white, which is kind of funny. Why king c1? Well, as I could surmise, the computer thinks that, okay, black is going to play queen e6, and white is going to have nothing better than trading, and so then it's going to be an end game, and king c1 may be the most useful move that white can play. But grandmasters don't really think like that, especially in rapid chess. You're going to probably play a little bit more ambitiously, aggressively, and don't have the regular rating points at stake. So he played rook g5, queen e6, rook f5. And objectively, black has a good chance to defend against this, and even could be objectively better with a move like f6. F6 is possible. Also, rook h8 is possible. But Grishuk here played a very natural-looking move. He went rook to the open file, and this loses instantly, and it took on but seconds, as he had, I think, planned out this, what is really a wonderful cheapo. He goes knight g5, and Grishuk captures it, and it looks like, okay, hg5, king g7, he's got things covered, but Vichy switches up the order and plays rook f7 first, and this sets up a hanging queen on e6, so black has to take, which deflects the queen from the defense of the mating square. So, Grishuk, when he saw this move, he was like, oh man, what did I do? And he pondered this situation for a little while, and then he decided to be sporting and let Anand put the mate on the board for the fans. And it's a lovely mate. Like I said, it's not complicated. But after hg, king moves, and then queen comes to h6. So it's a bit of a smothered mate. The rook and the queen boxing the king, and white mates with just a queen and one pawn. So a very nice finish there in that game for Anand, and he went on to win with 6 out of 9. Now, Daniil Dubov got one of his first tests at the elite level, and he acquitted himself quite well, especially in a fascinating win over fast chess specialist Hikaru Nakamura. So we'll see that one next. All right, so c4. This is an opening known as the floor Mykonos variation, and in the last few years I played a lot of c4 myself, and I find that this is a particularly very tricky kind of opening at the club level. Like a lot of 2100 players and below, let's say, that they don't necessarily know the differences between c4 and d4. And they think, just play natural knight f6, e6. There's a lot of tricks involved in this line. Of course, the theory is very refined at the grandmaster level, and this is one of the main lines. Of course, white has also recently been playing a lot of games with c takes d5 first instead of e5, and that has its nuances as well. But this is the more classic continuation. Queen takes e5. Personally, I like the move knight f3 here for white, but he goes d4, and the old variation is c5 here, and this is very popular when I was a teenager reading that little pamphlet, Modern Chess Theory, which would come out periodically, and chess players would eat it up because there were no computers or databases, so we very rarely got any information about games going on. But e5 has become the more recent and standard move, opening up the bishop, knight f3, and now here knight c6. Now, again, the more classic move here is e takes d4. The idea, bishop g5, queen e6 check, bishop e2, and then from here, for a long time, f6. There are a lot of games with this, but I think that kind of lost some popularity. And here, white can get a dangerous position with bishop f4, or even, this one reason I wanted to point it out, is the cool move bishop h6, which, doesn't do anything amazing, but it's just a cool move. Black can't take it because of bishop h5. F6 has really been kind of replaced by bishop e7, takes, knight takes, queen moves away, and they go from here. Knight c6 has been a more popular move in recent years, and it can lead to some very sharp stuff. But this game goes into very new territory quickly. Bishop e2 is not the most common move. That's bishop g5. Queen g6, d5, knight b8. And this has been seen at the high levels. Very sharp play. White has scored very well in these games. But that this doesn't necessarily discourage everybody from playing it for black, as we see from Hikaru Nakamura. But Dubov decided to take this in a different direction. He played bishop e2 and ed, bishop g5, queen g6. And now white is hesitating to take back on d4 because his cd4 bishop b4 check, that kills a lot of white's momentum by forcing a trade. So he castles, plays it kind of 19th century, even though this is an English. He's playing this a little bit, like an open game. So bishop d3 and bishop e7, and now comes c5, and I think this is a good move, actually. Sacrificing that pawn to gain a little time, and it seems that white is not really risking anything. That the best really that black can do is maybe equalize if he plays very, very accurately. So this check is awkward for black. If bishop d7, white will take it, and king takes is going to be a world of problems because the rook on a1 is going to come over very quickly. So queen takes, queen d7. A little surprising, the trade, but then after rook d1, that wins the piece because if black goes back to e8, rook to e1, etc. So queen a4, so bishop check was answered by king f8. And now black is going to have to really defend very well. Very complicated position. Okay, so queen e2. Now, the computer does not suggest any better way to play this for black. f6, rook d1 takes. And white does not have to take right away because the queen is still not going to be able to run away. But this is where black could play c2. This is not the only moment in the game where he could try c2 to try to distract white from the attack with that pawn. But he played instead bishop f5. And here is a very critical position in the game. Nakamura plays rook a d8. He's trying to maintain material equality. But Komodo says c2, gf5, bishop a2. I don't know if any human being, even in a slow game, could be expected to really appreciate that this works. It works for a draw according to the computer, because the c-pawn is strong enough, when a rook gets to c8 to back it up, that that's enough counterplay for a draw. Because it seems that white has, some strong continuations. First of all, this bishop c4 check, but takes, the king comes over, and it's not nearly as strong for white as it looks. It kind of traps the knight, and if check, king d8, and okay, then there's the c-pawn coming again. Now white can refine this a little bit in this line, c2, gf, bishop a2. He could play f6, But black could, for instance, play rook fc8, takes queen f6, king g8, and no win for white, only perpetual. But also f6, black has other moves. He can play g5, for instance. And even here, bishop c4 takes, the king goes and attacks the knight, the passed pawn on f6. It doesn't seem to make any difference in the position. It's still a draw. I mean, white can give away the knight and give perpetual check and draw, but he can't actually win. I don't know who would be expected to find that in a fast game. Nakamura played much more plausibly, but now white gets a mating attack. Bishop c4 check. It's still very complicated and very difficult to play accurately when you don't have a lot of time. All right, d5 is forced, otherwise it would be mate. Because now the bishop is not as good a square, the bishop can't come to d3 yet. But it goes back to c4, threatening bishop d3. Rook e8 is about the best that black could do. Check, king g5. Now, Dubov plays h4 check. He could play f4 check, which the computer actually rates a little bit higher. I think it's a more complicated move, but it also does win. King g4, queen d5, quiet move, which is maybe not so easy to see. King f4, queen d4 check. All right, now if you go back, queen g7, king f4, queen g3 is mate, so you have to kind of go to the side. Play something like this: bishop g6 check, king h6, bishop f7, threatening mate, and I think that should win for white. Going back to this position, after queen d4 check, king f3, queen h4. All right, not obvious. Queen h4 star move, that's the winner. Threatens queen g3, king e3. Then bishop h7, only move to win. And again, threatened mates on f2. Mate on f2, and bishop f5, it turns out, is the only move to avoid forced mate, and white can take the bishop and with a, or play queen f2 and take it with check with a winning position. All right. But I think actually I prefer what Dubov did, because there were some forced moves there that were not obvious, and I think that sometimes fans overlook that when they turn on the computer and they see these lines, you know, like which ones are actually, you know, more plausible to be able to find, because that's what it really comes down to. All right, so king takes h4 was quicker to check, and f4, and black can't really escape mate. So he played king h5, queen g3, threatening mate, bishop g4, f3, not only threatening the bishop, but threatening to take it, also with another mate threat. So he defends that, but now after king f2, he's got more ideas to take the bishop. And c2 was kind of a blunder. I think Nakamura was just about out of time here. Alternatively, he could play rook f8, queen e5 check, and then white could take the rook, and well, that should win. But basically, white gets an even better version of that, because after c2 he just takes it, and here rook d2 check would not help, because after the king goes back, black can't do anything, and white again is getting ready to take the bishop and with a mate threat. So I think he played rook f8 and actually resigned after that move, because white is going to play queen e5 check and take the rook and have a queen for rook. Huge advantage, and also about to win on time. So very nice game by Dubov, extremely complicated, very hard to play, and really a lot of fun to go through all the variations in that one. All right. All right, so on to the blitz. Sergei Karyakin won the blitz portion handily. He scored 10 out of 13, point half clear of Nakamura. Blitz games are always going to have their share of errors, even at the elite level. But I'd like to show a couple of games that got my attention. First, a sharp battle between Grishuk and Kramnik that shows the seesaw nature of these games. All right, so Grishuk playing white, and he tries a plan. I think we've seen this before on the show, that white keeps the d pawn back, has this long diagonal in play, and is looking to attack with spike g4. And f5, sometimes this can be a very effective block of white's attack. But Grishuk is not discouraged, although he probably gets a fairly shaky position. And after knight e4, he takes this knight, which really seems to be an absolute mistake, a miscalculation of sorts. But after knight d2, the strongest move appears to be e5, which is perhaps not that obvious, but the point is that after d5 is the most natural move, but queen b6 is a very strong move because not only hits the bishop, but also threatens the mate on f2, and this leads to very strong position for black. So Kramnik missed that, but also got a good position with queen a5, queen b3, and now probably the best move for black is just to take on g5. But I suppose, white could at least try to castle in that position, so Kramnik thought he had something even stronger with rook f2. If takes, queen takes d2, probably white will get mated shortly, but grandmasters don't give up that easily, so he can queen back to e3. And now black should have just brought the rook over, doubled on the f-file, and he still has a very strong position. But he brought the rook back to f5, but the threat to take on g5 just isn't that big a threat. And after castles, Kramnik caught himself and realized that if he plays bishop g5, white happily sacrifices that exchange. And after knight takes e4, suddenly white goes on the attack. He's got that long diagonal he's about to open and the g-file, and actually white would be much better. So Kramnik can still maintain the advantage by taking here, and there's still the white king is still pretty open. Knight takes e4, knight b4, and now Grishuk tries to kind of on the one hand plug up the c-file, on the other hand to open his bishop with knight c5, but objectively this is quite strong for black. Temporary sacrifice of the exchange in order to be able to take it back on g1. And now black has only one winning move, but it's there, queen b3, and it sets up ideas of knight a2 and knight c, followed by knight c3 check. Strong counterattack for black. A crucial line is queen d4, e5, and if queen takes d7, check, check again, and king a1, queen a2 is mate, king c1, black simply removes the bishop, and then gets access to the back rank, and this is actually mate. So queen b3 was a strong move, which certainly Kramnik would have found in a slower game, but probably he was running out of time. But after queen c6, suddenly things start to turn around. Queen d4, and black probably has to play rook takes g5, although this gives white a piece, but black at least has some pawns for it. After the retreat, rook f7, g6, white is already crashing through. If he tries to keep the h-file from being open, it doesn't really help much because rook e7, queen h4 is still very strong. Rook back, g takes, whether you take back or not. h6 is just going to open up all the lines on the on the king side, and it's going to be mate soon. So the game concluded HG, HG, rook E7, queen H4, and then he really kind of a spite check. Couple of spite checks. And that's that. I think Kramnik was not too upset about that game getting away from him with the those last couple of moves there. All right. Finally, I'm going to conclude with a game that is right up my alley, the liquidation into the pawn ending. And it was kind of an unusual one between Gelfand and Nepomniachtchi. And we'll take a look at that next. Okay, we're going to pick up the action in the endgame here. And Gelfand takes his pawn on d5, which gives black an interesting opportunity. Now, he could just play knight takes bishop. Then he gets a rook and pawn ending with an extra pawn. But rook and pawn endings with extra pawns, everything on one side of the board, they're usually going to be a draw. So he goes for rook takes e3. Of course, if white takes the rook, fork, and black wins. But there's rook f5, and desperado move rook takes g3. Now it's interesting, when I put it on the computer at first says that f takes g3 is the worst move, and that king takes g3 and h takes g3 draw. And I haven't gotten that far into it, but I might do it later, because this could go in a future edition of Liquidation on the Chessboard, because I always, love these endings, and this one is very interesting because I haven't really seen one like it before. But Gelfand takes with the f-pawn, which has a certain logic to it, because even black has these two f-pawns now, but white actually, even though he's pawned down, he has a potential possibility of making a passed pawn. Like at some point he can make a passed pawn with h4, so black has to respect that possibility. Okay, so king f3, g5, but there's going to be, well, here we have a mistake right here. Now, white, probably most prudent move is h3. I think h4 is even possible as well, but maybe even h3 is the simplest move, because white can really just sit on the position, and that actually will probably lead to a position that we basically saw in the game. But after king e3, black has a slightly unlikely looking winning move, and that's g4. And you can understand Nepom not finding it, especially this is a blitz game, and they're probably down to seconds, because it looks very stagnant, but the point is that king f4, king g6 is a zugzwang for black. So basically black is freezing this h pawn so that he can't create that passed pawn, and white has to, move the king somewhere. And the problem is that, okay, so he can wait around for the black king to come to g5 and now play king e3, but it doesn't help because f4 check, pawn takes, king f5, and this leads to a winning pawn ending for black. So this is what Nepom could have done to win the game. But he missed the move g4, played king g6, king f3. He has g4. No, he doesn't have g4 here, but he does have it here. And now apparently finds h3 and king e5. And this is the last move of the game, and it says that black won. But actually, the final position is a draw in a couple of different ways. One, white can play h4 here. If g4 check, king e3, f4 check, pawn takes, king e6. King f5, h5 actually leaves black in zugzwang and is going to lose. But now black is ready to make a protected passed pawn. And the huge mistake for white would be h5, because the king can still stop the pawn, and it just eventually comes around. Now king h4, king h6. The problem is that white does not have another square that can access h4, so he can't wait. For instance, if it were white, if white could pass in this position, black would still win by playing king h7. This kind of thing is in my book in probably many different examples. King h7 and then zugzwang, then king h6, and black wins. But white doesn't have to push the h pawn. In fact, if he just waits with the king, instead of h5, if he just waits with the king, basically just does anything, this position is a draw, because here white has two squares, at least two squares, to access g3 from. So he can avoid the poison square, right? If white plays king g3, king h5 is zugzwang, but white avoids that square, and black can wait, but white can wait too. So white waits for the king to come to h5 and then goes king g3. So that would be a draw. And finally, I believe that white could also play king e3, and if g4, it looks like taking is also sufficient, because he can play king d3, f5, king e3. This position with black to move would be, with white to move, I believe, would be a win. King d3, f4, and if the pawn gets to f3, that's also a win, as detailed in a few different places in my liquidation of the chessboard book. But the problem for black is that if black is on move, plays something like king d5, king d3, white has the opposition and is able to draw. But I guess Gelfand must have flagged. There was 3 second increment, but it didn't seem to help him. But anyway, very interesting pawn ending there. Okay, so that wraps things up from the Tal Memorial. Of course, several of the Tal participants have moved on to the candidates tournament, and as we're taping, they're kind of wrapping up round 3. Mamajarov, Karana, and Kramnik all jumped out to 1.5 out of 2. Kramnik has actually just dusted off Aronian in a really amazing game. And you're going to want to look more closely into that one, as Kramnik now takes a lead with 2.5 out of 3. And ICC is going to have video recaps of the action there. The first one will be tomorrow with Alex Yermolinsky. I'm sure that he's going to want to do that Kramnik game, and he's got some good stuff, because there's a lot of decisive games in the first 3 rounds from Berlin. So we'll have that. We'll also have a recap on the 17th, and I can tell you that I'll be doing one on March 25th. So I'm looking forward to that. There's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe next week I will have some reporting from the tournament in Reykjavik, which will be finishing in a few days. And there's also a couple of more norm tournaments going on in St. Louis. So a pretty rich time for international chess right now. But in any case, that does it for another week. I hope everyone enjoyed the show, and I hope that you'll join me, Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, next time on GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC.